Welcome to Nasdaq Trade Talks. I'm Jill Malandrino, global markets reporter at Nasdaq. Joining us for this segment, we have Scott Nations, president of Nations Indexes, to discuss upcoming earnings in some key Nasdaq 100 names as well as valuations. Scott, it's great to see you as always. Welcome back to Trade Talks. Now that the banks have kicked off the unofficial start of earnings season, we're starting to think about the Magnificent Seven and those companies reporting earnings, and valuations are high, indexes up over 40% for the year. Going to have to be able to justify those multiples, aren't they?
That's absolutely right. It's great to see the Nasdaq 100 up so much, as you said, but it's barely past the first half of the year. Think of what the year would be like if the second half were similar, and that's just too much to hope for. The danger now is that some of the biggest names have really gotten expensive. So Apple, the biggest name in the stock market in general, the forward PE there is over 30. Microsoft, which is number 2, is nearly 33 forward PE. Google, a little bit more reasonable, but you don't have to go very far down, 7th, and you get to something like Tesla, which is a forward PE of 77. So 43% year to date for the Nasdaq 100, but that means that all of these valuations are really high. And now the problem is, if one of these big names were to really disappoint in a non-idiosyncratic way, so if they were to point to something that was systemic or likely to affect a number of the big names, then you really have to worry, because investors are going to start selling the names where they have some big profits.
Scott, do you think this was a case of Tina, there is no other alternative? I mean, there's certainly, many stocks within the trading universe that, are good investments as well, besides these 7 that we mentioned.
Yeah, I think part of what's going on, and I think you're onto something really important here, is there's a little availability bias going on with investors right now. So they think of names that they might want to invest in, and there are only a few that they can readily call to mind because we're talking about them all the time. You hear about them all the time. One of my favorite names is Deere, John Deere. It's just a great name. It's likely to benefit from inflation, but it's not a really exciting company, and so you don't talk about it all the time. It certainly is not going to be an AI company that people think about. So, when we talk about AI, we talk about NVIDIA and all those other names, and so they, along with the big tech names, they're just the ones that people think about when it comes time to invest.
Which is so interesting that you bring up an industrial as an example. I mean, the technical transformations that are happening there, and certainly they're leveraging AI. I mean, every industry and vertical is. So I think there are other derivative plays, to your point, that aren't just, you would typically think of that comes up in the news cycle. So I think that's important for investors to remember. Now, if we take a look at VolQ for a moment here, are there any indications there about what's coming up with earnings season?
Yeah, it's really interesting, the setup, because VolQ is not at its 52-week low. And again, VolQ is the Nasdaq 100 volatility index. It's not right at its 52-week low, but it's pretty close. It's within a couple of points, hovering around 18. Below 20 is interesting, particularly given where we are in the cycle, and that we have earnings for a bunch of these names coming out shortly, that they're all at lofty valuations. It may not seem that they're vulnerable to negative surprises, but that's what makes a surprise, is that we don't expect it. And so I do think the fact that implied volatility in the Nasdaq 100 complex is low means that investors who are a little worried and who don't want to just be along for a ride that they don't really understand, they have an opportunity here to buy some protection. They could buy NDX put spreads or QQQ put spreads for very reasonable levels right now and get some really neat protection.
All right, Scott, appreciate the insight as always. Thanks for joining us on Trade Talks. I'm Jill Malandrino, global markets reporter at Nasdaq.